Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video. As the Second World War continued into 1941 amidst heavy fighting, the Allies found themselves in a desperate situation. Having suffered humiliating defeats in Europe at the hands of German forces and in the Pacific against the Japanese, few policymakers or military leaders believed the Soviet Union would be successful in defending itself against a German invasion. Any chance of an ultimate Allied victory seemed remote, and England's Prime Minister Winston Churchill firmly believed that only with the help of the United States would there be any hope of defeating the Axis powers. Eventually, after much correspondence between the two leaders, Churchill convinced U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt to meet with him face-to-face to discuss their shared vision for a post-war world. Little did Churchill realize at the time the ramifications their discussions would have on England's imperial hold on India, which was popularly referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. On August 9, 1941, Churchill arrived aboard the battleship HMS Prince of Wales off the coast of Newfoundland at Naval Base Argentia, where Roosevelt waited on the U.S. heavy cruiser SS Augusta. Although diplomats on both sides had already begun drafting the text of a joint declaration that later came to be known as the Atlantic Charter, there were still details to iron out between the two leaders. And while the Atlantic Charter was not binding on either party, it proved successful in affirming the solidarity between the U.S. and Britain against Axis aggression and laid out both leaders' desire for a post-war world characterized by the free exchange of trade, self-determination, and collective security. This was a monumental agreement, eventually paving the way for the establishment of the United Nations and influencing policymaking at the global level for generations to come. This self-determination clause caused disagreement between Churchill and Roosevelt, with Churchill rejecting its universal applicability when it came to the self-determination of subject nations such as British India. Since British colonies never had sovereign rights before the war, there was no pre-existing sovereign government to restore to power after it. Roosevelt was reluctant to place pressure on the British in regard to India and other colonial possessions, and as a result, Mahatma Gandhi, leader of the Quit India movement, refused to support the British or the American war effort against the Axis powers in any way. Against the backdrop of World War II, and in addition to the conditions laid out by the Atlantic Charter, Britain had to contend with the political and religious upheaval of its largest colony. In addition to Gandhi's Quit India movement, Subhash Chandra Bose, another prominent Indian leader of the time, actively promoted supporting the Axis powers as a means of emancipation from British imperial rule. This was very similar to the political strategy utilized by Japanese leaders in Tokyo, which involved appealing to the colonized people of Asia as their liberator from imperial rule. Thousands of native nationalists in Burma, inspired by the Japanese rhetoric, subsequently helped the Japanese oust the British. Exacerbating this situation was the fact that Bengal, where Bose's influence was the strongest, was also the first region lying in the path of the Japanese advance. Thus, Britain was forced to reassess its position across the China-Burma-India theater as political considerations transformed into military ones with dire consequences. It was evident to the British Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, and his councils that because of the Indian desire for independence, they could not mobilize the masses required in order to fight a Japanese invasion. Only the Indian nationalist movement, whose presence was pervasive, was capable of this task. As invasion became imminent, a change in the British approach was required, and even British public opinion began to insist on it. This led to an attempt in late March 1942 by the British government to secure full Indian cooperation and support for the war effort. The mission was headed by a senior minister, Stafford Cripps, and while ultimately a failure, became instrumental in India's move towards independence. Although Churchill paid lavish tribute to the unsurpassed bravery of Indian soldiers and officers, and the British Indian Army served with distinction in North Africa, Italy, and across the China-Burma-India theater, there were those within the ranks who did not sympathize with British war aims or values, and while the bulk of its forces were committed to fighting the Japanese army, those disaffected soldiers not fully indoctrinated to support the British ended up joining the Imperial Japanese Army under Subhas Chandra Bose to throw off British imperial rule. After the Second World War ended, the small percentage of Indian soldiers who had fought against the Allies were put on trial in what came to be known as the Indian National Army Trials or the Red Fort Trials. These trials attracted much global attention and public sympathy, especially in Britain, and the outcry against them forced British Army Chief Field Marshal Claude Auchinleck to commute the sentences of the three primary defendants. This incident, a mutiny in the Indian Royal Navy, and a general British desire to decamp from India after its independence, resulted in the removal of all British military forces from India. While the Indian independence movement had started long before World War II and been resisted by subsequent British governments, including Churchill's, the signing of the Atlantic Charter completely reframed the issue of self-determination for all colonial powers and their colonial holdings around the world. With the decline of British economic, military, and political power and prestige after the war, and Churchill's ouster from power by new Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Indian independence became not a question of if, but when.